welcome everyone to another Conversations in the Void. I am Graveyard, as joined as always with my off-screen producer Salem. Make sure to say hi to Salem in chat. He likes to read your guys' comments and just snicker to himself behind the scenes here. So I am really ecstatic for the guest we have tonight because I've been diving heavy into this podcast, and because as a writer myself, I would dive deep into No Sleep when it started. He is executive producer, creator, showrunner, voice actor, and host of the No Sleep podcast, which is in its 21st season with almost 13 years, about a couple weeks away from 13 years from the first episode, with over 500 episodes and thousands of hours. Please welcome the one and only David Cummings.
Graveyard, how are you? Thanks for having me on the show.
Good. Thanks for coming on. Like I said, we happen to meet in chat with Distance During and Marie Restbook when she was on there, and you just happened to be popping there for her interview. I'm like, hey, I know that name. Let's see if we can't get him onto the show. And here we are.
It all worked out. We can credit Marie Westbrook for this.
There you go. So how you doing tonight? Good?
Doing very well. It's always busy days here at the No Sleep podcast, but it's nice to be able to talk to you in the evening. I'm usually heading off to bed around this time, so it's fun to be up and chatting.
Well, they don't call it the No Sleep podcast for no reason, right?
Of course.
Yes. All right. So, I mean, you obviously you like horror stories, you like writing and stuff like that. Do you recall, we talked about horror movies, stuff like that. Do you remember your first horror movie?
My first horror movie. Were movies around when I was a kid? I think they were. It's funny. This is really not a horror movie, but it was something I found online just recently. My wife and I just watched it. It was a movie from, I think, 72 or something, and it's called Arnold. And it's basically a horror comedy. The leaning way into the comedy more than the horror. But the gist is this guy named Arnold. He dies, but before he dies, he divorces his wife, and he gets this nubile young woman to literally marry his corpse, and she thinks she's going to make off with his fortune, and then he ends up systematically, his corpse, or is he still alive? We never know. He ends up systematically killing all the people in his family who kind of betrayed him. So my mom took me to see that in the movie theater. I was 7, 8 years old. So I will count that as my first horror movie because of some of the gruesome deaths that very PG friendly, but it was a fun movie.
Oh yeah. I vaguely recall that movie existing. I haven't watched it probably in a very, very long time. And with our other podcasts that we do movie reviews and stuff like that. We do theme stuff. And that's something to add to the list, I think, and try to find weird stuff like that. Almost like I Was a Teenage Zombie might kind of go with that. I feel a little bit too.
Exactly. Yeah. Very campy. Very, people like Roddy McDowall is in it, Stella Stevens. And it's funny because, I don't know, early 70s, but there's a number of scenes with the very vivacious Stella Stevens walking around in lingerie and stuff like that. So my wife was teasing me. It wasn't my first horror movie. It was my first, the first movie that sort of got the fire in the loins going.
Yeah. Now, do you a big horror buff, especially with the podcast and the reading stuff like that? Do you have time to watch a lot of movies?
I try to catch the horror movies that, kind of everyone's talking about. But yeah, I don't know if it's whether it's not having enough time. I think a lot of it is because I'm kind of immersed in horror, throughout the day, and I'm editing horror stories and that kind of thing. So in the evening, I'm either burned out or, the thought of sitting down and watching a really intense horror movie, sometimes those movies get put to the back burner. But I do try to keep up on some of the big ones out there. But I could list a dozen that, people in the last, say, 10 years, these classic horror movies that I should have seen, but I haven't. So it's kind of an occupational hazard that way.
Right. I mean, did you have a chance to watch them when you were younger? Did you ever have that craving, I'm gonna date myself here too, going to the old, VHS rental store and just picking out a movie based on the cover?
Oh, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned VHS. When I was younger, I worked in a video store, and then later on I worked for a company that opened up video store franchises. And so I kind of went in when stores were opening up, and I would help stock the shelves and teach them how to use the computers and all that. So yeah, the idea of going to a video store, not even with DVDs, but to see the shelves of VHS tapes. And it always kind of makes me laugh to think back how there's the huge, well, of course, new releases, and then the huge comedy and the huge action section, and then here's the shelves with horror, the
Yeah.
horror shelves. But yeah, the covers of those horror movies, yeah, they're so compelling, and they really drew your eye and got you renting them.
Oh, for sure. That was kind of our first episode we did too, was like the video covers, because that's all you had. You had the cover, and you had like the paragraph and a half on back to say, I'm spending my money on this movie.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And they were usually, if it was kind of a slasher movie where teenagers were getting killed, of course you have the busty women on the cover, and anything to just get your eye looking at the cover.
Right, for sure. Now, in your time, has there been any horror? It doesn't have to be movie, but franchise, IP, story, comic that you think doesn't get enough love in it, that you just go, how have you not seen this or read this?
That is a good question. I often, if I ever get asked, what's your favorite horror movie, or what's a movie that you would want people to see, I always think of the movie from, I think I'm going to say 1980, called The Changeling.
Yes.
Classic film, George C. Scott, Trish Van Devere. It was actually filmed in Canada, so I have a little patriotic love for that. But I personally, I think it's the best haunted house movie ever made. And so, yeah, I would, it's just a standalone story, no sequels. It's not a franchise, but if anyone has a chance to watch The Changeling, it's a classic. I love it.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. It feels like it got lost in the video nasty era of the 80s. That like it's not that huge kill scene. I don't think it just got lost by the slashers, realistically.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it is, other than one brief scene, there's really no blood, there's no killing. It's just psychological, kind of gothic horror, and it's wonderful.
And I think that kind of makes sense with what you do with the No Sleep podcast, because you are building atmosphere with just the music, with the voiceover actors too, and it's not, you have the imagination going with it, so it seems like a good psychological horror would be absolutely right up your alley too.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one thing I often say about, when people ask about audio horror, I always talk about how it has its own kind of power, because when you're telling an audio horror story, you're only describing things and you're giving audio clues or cues, but you allow the audience to picture in their own mind what scares them. So I often use the example of, if it takes place and if you go down to this dank, dark basement, well, everyone could probably picture in their own mind what their most frightening dark basement looks like. Right. And so that's, audio horror has such a special power that way, because it involves people's imagination.
And it really, like I said, listening to the podcast really harkens back to the old radio shows that existed, that we didn't have the TV, we didn't have all that stuff, and it was all auditory. And just like, and that's why I love podcasting so much, especially the audio horrors, because it brings you back to that time frame that most people don't realize existed anymore.
No, you're absolutely right. And I often cite the fact that when I was a kid growing up in Toronto, when I was a teenager, 12, 13 years old, every Sunday night, a local radio station from 10 to 11 played the old time horror shows like Lights Out and Suspense and things like that, Inner Sanctum. And I would lie in bed and listen to them every Sunday night. And that, I love that. And that stirred in me that kind of passion. And so many years later, when podcasting kind of came on the scene, and I realized, maybe I could try to evoke those same things and create those same kind of productions. And so here we are. And, as you said, 13 years later, we're still creating audio horror fiction for the masses.
Yeah. And it almost feels like, I know it's scripted and written stuff like that, but it feels like the old Art Bell Coast to Coast stuff too. The strange, the paranormal. And I love that.
Yeah, and we try to kind of give a really wide breadth
Hmm.
of horror. So it's we cover kind of the two broad areas. So you have the more supernatural, paranormal, ghosty stories, and then you have the more realistic stories, the
Hmm.
where bad people doing bad things to other people. But yeah, we've always loved to delve into things like science fiction or the that still has horror in it, but
Hmm.
it does create more of that reality based stuff. So yeah, you mentioned Art Bell. I mean, just what a classic radio show to hear all these. So they're engaging stories, but they're also
Hmm.
creepy, and so yeah, it's there's such great content that we can share in that manner.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. My co-host Salem, he loves to write. And I've written. He does a lot more sci-fi and cyberpunk stuff like that too. And I'm trying to help me write horror movies because I'm not a good writer. He's my wordsmith for me. So we are working on stuff too, just little small skits or trailers or 40-minute horror movies too. And just the words are so powerful, I think with it. And
Yeah.
I like the fact that with the Low Sleep podcast also too, because with it being audio, I always describe, the lack of words sometimes is a huge impact in horror movies as well, and horror IPs. And I think that plays a part too with what you guys do.
Yeah, it's so true. It's I was thinking recently about one of the most powerful things in horror, and certainly in audio horror, is the ability to bring silence
Hmm.
into the production. And when you can have this frenetic scene and there's sound effects and there's banging, and then all of a sudden there's silence, it can be very powerful. It grabs your attention. But
Hmm.
if you've set up this very tense scene, and like you say, you take away the words, you take away the sound, it's really powerful. So I always preach in terms of audio production of horror stuff, use silence as much as possible. It's cheap and it's easy, and I mean cheap in the sense that you don't have to pay for a plug-in to create silence. So it's so effective. It's the main tool in any horror audio producer's toolbox.
Yeah, like I said, it silence itself is a character in a good story.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, I mean, I like I said, doing research on you, that you essentially said that you were brought back into VO work was because of the doing the No Sleep podcast and started up again, right? So, what kind of created that pause, and what was like coming back into it?
Yeah, I was doing VO work, maybe a little strong statement, but back in the 90s, I was involved. I played in a band, just like a little local band, but
Hmm.
we would have opportunities to go to the recording studios. And when I was there in the studio, killing time, and we worked with a lot of great musicians. And so, anytime you put a microphone in front of me, I'm always going to goof around and, use a big radio voice and all that kind of thing. And
Right.
guys would hear me talk like that and they'd say, "Hey man, you got a great voice, can you?" And I ended up doing all these things where these musicians, they would create like these demo tapes,
Hmm.
and they just needed like a little bumper at the beginning, Corey Lacey on guitar or stuff like that, and they just
Right.
wanted this voice that I could do. And so I did a little stuff like that, a little bit of voiceover things just for friends. And then I had to kind of get a real job in the 2000s. And
Hmm.
but it was about 2010, and I thought, why not? I was working full time, and I needed a little bit of stress relief, and so I thought, let me kind of get back, or not get back into, but start looking into this world of voiceover and that kind of thing. And I did some voice training and got a vocal coach and that type of thing. And then the No Sleep podcast, the concept of it was landed in my lap, and then it's kind of snowballed into me kind of running the whole thing.
Right. I mean, so it's just amazing that you said the No Sleep subreddit's been around for as long as it has, and like I said, it shows longevity and the creation and really the drive of creators writing these stories, and then you and your team really bring it to life, because it's different when you're reading it. Like, because when I read, I have to listen to my own voice in my head when reading
Right.
it, and I think it's obviously working well for you guys to be as longevity as you have with it, and all the awards you won, the accolades, and being spotlight in a lot of places. I mean, what's it like for you? Did you ever imagine when you started this that you're here almost 13 years later still doing it?
Yeah, I absolutely thought when I started this, it's going to last for so many years and I'd be doing it full time, and it's all according to plan. Um, Boy, yeah, it's yeah, never expected anything like this. And it's funny how when it started, it was really just a couple of people had this idea, and I heard
Hmm.
about the idea, and I thought, hey, I'll do some narration if you want. Other people were supposed to produce it and host it and all this kind of
Hmm.
stuff. But the people who were kind of volunteered to do all that, I guess they were all in university, and they were, exams were coming up, and nobody was just kind of picking up the ball. And so I thought, I'll narrate a story, and then I will kind of slap together the first episode. And I did that, and nobody picked up for the second episode. So I did that, and the third and fourth, and then before you knew it, it was my show.
Hmm.
And yeah, to see it grow the way it has, yeah, it's beyond anything I could have imagined. Of course, it started back in 2011, and I often joke that back then, all I heard, the main question I heard was, "What's a podcast?" Because nobody knew what it was back then. And so
Right.
to do that sort of faithfully for 2 years, and
Hmm.
uh, you know, it got to the point where I thought, I wonder if this show, if there was a way for it to generate at least enough money to just pay the bills, because at that point it was just me paying out of my pocket, and I was
Right.
buying software, and I was buying microphones and
Hmm.
sound effects libraries and all that kind of thing. So it would be nice to just at least get reimbursed to break even. And then if we were going to do that, pay some of the voice actors. That was always my goal as someone who was aspiring to be some sort of voice actor. I
Hmm.
thought, man, if we could pay people, because back then it was always just volunteer stuff. So, yeah, to see it come along, and then to realize, it took me a long time to realize that the breadth of the audience, how many people were listening. And then people would contact me and say, "Hey, I'd love to do a voice on it." And then in season 4, a gentleman by the name of Brandon Boone reached out, and is a musician,
Hmm.
and he said, "I'd love to help with some of the music," because I was doing most of the music at that point. And so Brandon came on, and he has become integral to the show. His scores, his musical compositions are outstanding. And then, yeah, it just snowballed from there. People started to become a part of it, and yeah, winning awards here and there. I feel like I'm really patting myself on the back, but it's just what happened, right? And
Right.
so and then, yeah, we keep going. It's never in a million years would I've dreamt of anything like this.
Yeah, our chat saying, was Brandon Boone gifted to you from the heavens?
The heavens, or some other place, I don't know, but he is definitely a gift, that's for sure.
I mean, like I said, I feel you, because we've been doing our other podcast. We're almost at episode 100 of that one, and we've been doing
Nice.
it less than 2 years.
Yeah.
We unfortunately go way too crazy in October. We do a movie a day for that.
Wow, that's great.
I definitely feel. My wife goes, "When are you going to stop paying for stuff out of pocket for this?" I go, "I don't know."
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, we were, very, really, really, really small, but I look at like our metrics and sometimes like that. I go, we have people in Belgium listening to us like every episode. I'm just going, I don't, doesn't make sense to me.
It's so true. Years ago, well, shortly after I started looking at analytics. Back
Hmm.
then, it was all iTunes stuff, and
Right.
yeah, you start to look at the downloads, and it's like, the Philippines, or Thailand, or things like that, or Kenya, and
Hmm.
it's like, how are people? I mean, obviously, people in those countries speak English, and they would enjoy a podcast like this, but it was mind blowing to think that there are literally people from around the world who are listening to this little dog and pony show that I'm slapping together. It was just mind blowing.
Yeah, it's kudos to you and your team for, like I said, keeping up. Like I said, you're almost at 13. Like I said, 3 weeks away. I'm just thinking, like, do I want to be doing what I'm doing in 13 years? Ooh.
Yeah, it's I mean, look, I love what I do. It's my dream
Hmm.
job. I couldn't want for anything else but this job. But at the same time, it's not easy. It's
Right.
people often say, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And I always say, no, if you love what you do, you'll never work harder in your life, because you're so passionate about it.
Hmm.
And to run something like this, it's not easy. And I have been I always say I've been learning as I go. There's no university degree in podcasting, at least not, there probably is now, but there wasn't back
Right.
then. There's no textbooks to follow.
Hmm.
It was just, how do you run a podcast? How do you grow it? How do you market it? It's not been easy, but I love it.
Yeah, that's something we struggle with too, is just getting that marketing. And this is why I helped create the show, is because I love talking to people in the horror world and people like yourself with other podcasts. I think you're the first like official podcast we have on, and 30 episodes now. And it's just great hearing the same struggles, the same pain points of growing that we run into ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all a very common experience that,
Mhm.
because most people, obviously you're working at home, I'm sure there are podcasts now that have their own studios and everyone gathers and does it together. But, from our team, we're all around the world. We're in Canada, the US, Europe, and all of that. And people are doing their work at home alone, and then everything gets conglomerated together, and the producers put it all together. But, so yeah, you're kind of working in isolation and yet within a team, and it's
Mhm.
it's a very unique way to do things.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'm lucky enough with my co-host. We work professionally in our day jobs together too. So then
Nice.
this is the stuff we do outside of work. We spend even more time together.
Nice, nice.
I'm surprised he's not sick of me yet. I'm sure he is.
Check your back for those knives that get stabbed in the back.
Oh no, it's he drives me forward. It's just a great way of doing it. It's just fun. It really, really
Yeah,
is.
absolutely.
Now what you talk about, the pain points, stuff like that. Is there any advice you'd have given yourself 13 years ago that you wish you knew then?
Boy, yeah, I mean, for me specifically, it would be, back then there was never a concept of like the business of the podcast.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned, it took me a couple of years. And as podcasts were growing, the idea of subscriptions or generating some sort of revenue. So I would definitely be, if you're thinking about going into podcasting, there is a very real possibility of it generating income. And so if you're going to be doing that, make sure you have a good handle on financial stuff. It's
Hmm.
my weakest point. So that's one thing. But I think the other thing that I've learned is, and if I could go back and do it again, I would probably put myself forward a little bit more. And that might sound strange because I've always been the voice of the podcast. I've always hosted
Right.
it, but for the longest time, like for the first 2 years, I don't even think I introduced myself. I was just the voice. It
Right.
wasn't like, hey, I'm David Cummings. I'm just some guy. And I think a show needs a good, strong personality.
Hmm.
And I don't know if it's because I'm Canadian or what it is, but I tend to be someone always willing to push others to the spotlight and to just, I'll stay in the background. But I think a show needs a good, strong presence. And I probably should have been more upfront and more like, hey, I am David Cummings and this is my show. And so, love it or hate it, but I'm the guy who's kind of feeding you this stuff. And I think
Right.
when you do that, you allow the audience to kind of get to know this person or this
Hmm.
this personality, and that helps them connect with the show more.
Oh yeah, you're generally the first voice that everyone hears, and you are the introduction. And you are, let's say, the crypt keeper. You are the bookend that is tying and introducing the stories to us, and I absolutely love it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the crypt keeper. Or my hero growing up was always Vincent Price, and
Yes,
his kind
yes.
of sitting in the big leather bound chair by the
Hmm.
fire, reading scary stories. He's my hero.
Now, without getting too much into the nitty gritty, how do you pick stories to do? Do you have people? I know you have submissions, and how do you go from picking stories back, 13 years ago to stories now?
Well, when we first started, as you would tell by the name of the podcast, it was very much connected to the subreddit No
Right.
Sleep.
Hmm.
And back then, I mean, in the very early days, I would literally read through stories and just say, "Hey, this could work.
Hmm.
This might work." And then, using Reddit's DM, I would reach out to the authors and get their permission and that type of thing. But so we did that for a while, and then we had some people volunteering to help out to just to scan through Reddit and find the good stories. And then after a while, Reddit as a subreddit, it just became a little difficult and untenable to try to kind of weed through.
Mhm.
By then the subreddit had grown so much, and so the amount of stories was just, hard to go through. But it became harder to kind of connect with authors and stuff like that. And so we decided to open up submissions.
Mhm.
And so now, and probably for 7 years now, we have done almost exclusively stories that had been submitted to us directly by the authors. And we have a great editorial team headed up by one of our great voice actors, Jessica McAvoy and Ashley McAnally. These two women work their way tirelessly through the number of submissions we get is overwhelming, and they have to go through and separate the wheat from the chaff, as they say. We find the stories that we think are really effective on the show. And so we're really fortunate that we have this huge mountain of stories that we can choose from. And yet at the same time, it's difficult to work through those. So I give those ladies all the credit for finding the gems that they do.
Yeah, for sure. And AJ, I was asking, who's your favorite Atticus Jackson on the podcast?
There's a couple of Atticus Jacksons that we work with, but there's one in particular that we steer clear of. I will say that. Yeah.
So with reading all these stories and stuff like that, even in the beginning and going through the subreddits and submissions, has there ever been a story just that actually kept you up like all night, like that just really messed with your head?
That messed with my head. There's been so many great stories that we've been able to do. There's one. It's kind of an infamous story that we've done on the podcast. It's one that I was the main narrator for, and it's called The Pancake Family. And it's I don't really want to spoil it, but it has to do with a cop who was kind of pulled back into a cold case that he can never solve, and he ends up finding the sort of titular family. And there's a reason they're called the Pancake Family. And that was a story that the way I recorded it and how I performed it was sort of different than I usually do. And I kind of, to sound like a pretentious actor, I really kind of became that character, and I lived that character for that time. And so I think it's such a creepy story, and it's kind of a gory story. And so I would say the Pancake Family is one that really kind of stuck with me.
For sure. I will definitely have to make sure I listen to that next. I'm a place. I like to start from the beginning because I'm a completionist. I start at the very beginning of everything I ever do.
Right.
But yeah, like I said, I've been pick and choosing stuff right now just to get it going. Like I said, I just listened to your new episode 1 of season 21 as well. And especially, I said I don't want to spoil anything anyone has listened to it, but let's say Abe's story was was great.
Yeah. There's always, I think, a good mix of stories. So there are stories that are shorter and little, easier to chew on. There's longer stories. There's stories that are just, kind of easy to digest. And then there are stories that will really mess with your head. So I think we give a good, our menu is very full.
Yeah, for sure. I said, I love it. I'm the type of person that can listen to and watch all things horror and then go to sleep soundly. So I love my wife. She's like, don't put anything on for like an hour before bed. Nothing scary. Has to be happy things. Like,
Yeah. And it's funny how many people, if, we've done live shows and that type of thing, and the number of people who come up to me and they say, hey, I love your show. I listen to it every night, but and they look so like hurt. Like they go, I'm sorry, but it helps me fall asleep. And they seem so apologetic. And I'm like, listen, I understand. I've listened to it at night and I'm sawing logs in minutes.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk briefly on Tales from the Void. And I saw this and I thought, like, holy crap, that is like a great next step is what you guys are doing, is essentially taking stories that you have discussed and then putting it into the visual medium of it. What's that been like for you so far?
Well, Tales from the Void started in terms of my involvement probably 3 years ago. I was contacted by a gentleman known as his name is Francesco Loschiavo, And he reached out because he wanted to create, at that time, he wanted to just do like a web series, basically maybe just 6
Hmm.
YouTube videos. And so he had that idea. He wanted to do them with horror, and he wanted to do stories from the subreddit. And the stories that he was really drawn to were most of the ones we had done on the podcast as well. So he had read the stories, then he had heard our audio adaptations.
Hmm.
And so, he was really keen on doing that. And as with so often happens with stuff like this, it kind of, ebbs and flows, and
Right.
it's going, it's not going, it's going. And then a couple of years went by, and he reached out and he said, we've gotten funding. It's all a kind of a Canadian production, and so
Okay.
with things like film grants and tax credits and all that. So he was able to put together this amazing team. He was running it. His co-showrunner, John Thomas Kelly. They connected with a man named Barclay Maud, who is been around for years in the Canadian film industry. And what started as this YouTube channel all of a sudden became this incredible production where we had chosen 6 stories,
Hmm.
and we started to, I say we, to be clear, I'm kind of a late joiner to all of this. I'm more a sort of a consultant marketing kind of person on this one, but to see this team create these stories, and I've had the opportunity to visit the set a couple of times, and I can assure people this is not people filming with SLR cameras or iPhones, and on the cheap,
Right.
guerrilla filming where you're running through alleys without permits or anything.
Hmm. Yeah.
This is high quality. The acting, the crew is top notch, and I think people are going to be blown away by how good this looks, how good it sounds, but more than that, just how well the stories are conveyed on the screen. And I'm so excited to have the show come out this fall, and to have people react to it, because I think it's going to be something very special.
Oh, I cannot wait for this. I was lucky enough to be part of you talk about the guerrilla camera making and low quality, not quality, but low budget stuff. I happen to be executive producer of a found footage anthology show that just finished wrapping season 1, and there's being put out and seeing what we can do with it. And I've been asked then to write and direct something for season 2 as well.
Nice.
And it is that guerrilla warfare stuff at that point in time, just because we don't have the budget, we don't have all that stuff to do it, but still it's great. And I love to see that move. We have from written word to the spoken word, then to you guys doing the visual media.
Right.
It's just next logical progression. Do you have any overlap of the actors doing the voices? Are they going to play like their same characters if you do them as a show?
We do, in season 1, no, there actually is no overlap in that regard. But our fingers are crossed if we get picked up for a second season. I'm certainly going to do what I can to get some of our great actors on there, because that's the other thing we've been very fortunate about, is we have a number of our regular voice actors who act. They're on TV shows, they've done movies, they're on the
Mhm.
stage. So yeah, I would love to see that happen. And yeah, I think we've got enough talent that we could do something like that.
That is awesome. I cannot wait for
Mm.
it. High quality, not birdemic or feeders quality.
Absolutely.
I mean, as much as I love great horror too, I love cheesy bad horror too.
Oh, of course.
It's
Yeah.
it's what I live for. The cheesier the better. My producer will tell you he absolutely cannot stand them himself, but it's all good stuff.
Mhm.
So yeah, you said 6 episodes planned right now. You said you're hopefully releasing it in the fall.
That's my understanding. Yeah, we're gonna try to do it. It's always just the fall, and of course, it's a horror anthology. So I think October would be a good bet, but we're
Yeah.
still waiting to see what the powers that be decide to do with it.
Yeah, I'm interested. That's one of are you going to be the narrator and the host for that too?
Not really. What's going to happen is the shows will stand kind of out on their own,
Okay.
just start to finish, and then um, I think there's two aspects of it. There's this show is we've got the rights to present it in Canada and in the US.
Okay.
And so there are these requirements in terms of the length of the stories, how long they have to be, and different things. And so I believe it's the US version. When the episodes end, they'll run about 25-ish minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so to fill out, let's say, a full half hour, at the end of the episode, I host kind of a short interview segment where I interview the person who wrote the story we just presented.
Oh,
So
nice.
I will be kind of a backdoor crypt keeper where so we'll come out of the episode and I'll be sitting there speaking with one of the authors. And so that's the only way you'll see me on the screen at this time. But I mean, what a thrill to be able to do that.
Yeah, we just call you Rod Sterling too.
Hey, there you go. That's another hero. What a talent he was.
Absolutely. Yeah, like I said, thank you everyone for coming on to the show for the chat tonight. We are running out of time. We actually ran out of time, but we have more questions to talk here. I'm having such a blast, but I want to be cognizant and respectful of your time. So let's get into our hard questions that we like to ask. This is interesting because I like to see what your answer is, because you are coming from the podcast where what's better, do you think, CGI or practical effects?
I think when there is CGI that you don't know is CGI, I think the people talk about invisible CGI. I think that can be really effective. But I tend to believe, I don't know who said this, but I heard this great quote that said, CGI looks real but feels fake. Practical effects look fake, but they feel real. And so, yeah, you look back at the old horror films where, someone gets stabbed and the red paint comes out and they go to the butcher shop and get some organs and they spill out of the guts. And it's like, it's totally fake, but there's something about it that feels more authentic.
Oh yeah. I absolutely agree. Like I said, everyone has said practical. Like I said, you being, the podcast guy is interested to see what you have to say, because I work with a lot of writers and directors and filmmakers that, like, of course, practical because it's cheaper for us than the low budget indie horror film world.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, but to that point though, we have John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982, and here we are 42 years later, and then we had the CG version of it in 2011, vastly different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's just something about again, it's practical effects, it's latex, it's makeup, it's blood squirting and that kind of thing. But I often think when it comes to CGI, back in the day, it was like the squib, someone gets shot, and there's the little explosive that blows out the red blood and everything, and it's fake. And then these days I see everywhere a guy getting shot, and you can tell it's just a CGI overlay, just a red splotch. And again, maybe that's what a real gunshot looks like, but it just doesn't feel as authentic.
Oh, absolutely agree. All right, so if you were to work with any franchise, if you were able to tell a story in any world that exists today, is there one you'd want to tell? Like if you wanted to do an audio podcast of the next Halloween movie, let's say.
That's fascinating. That would be, I think, my wife is just an absolute diehard fan of the Halloween franchise. She loves that. I love the movies too. She kind of, when she was younger, it was one of those first horror stories for her. So she has that effect, that connection to it. But it's interesting to think, if there's IP or the kind of franchises to say, now we're going to adapt it to audio. So many of the established ones, I think, might be a little difficult, because if you're so used to the visual element of it, like a story like Nightmare on Elm Street, I think if you can't see Freddy Krueger and you can't see the claws and the burned flesh and all that, so yeah, it would be interesting to think, and not something I've really thought of before, how you take an existing, unless it's just a story, but an existing visually presented film, and then try to adapt it to audio. That'd be challenging for sure.
I think your sound effects would come into play, because especially with, like, I think existing IP, like, Freddy Krueger, you can have the metal scraping, and in your head, you're going to visualize him.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, audio cues are very powerful that way. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think it'd be fun. It'd be a fun challenge to try.
For sure. Like I said, I'd love to see it just because I'd love to see, you have people like, Robert England's like, I'm never playing Fred again because he doesn't want to do the makeup. But if he's only
Yeah.
voice, we can still have characters live on just via work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I'm seeing, and I'm sure, I mean, you especially would know, is starting to see content like this adapted to video games. And I
Hmm.
think that's where, like you say, maybe you get Robert Englund who doesn't want the makeup or anything, but you get a video game character where he can just voice him and he's
Hmm.
going to, the character on screen is going to look like Freddy. I think that's a great way to go. And yeah, we've had stops and starts, but if there's one thing I would love to do is to be involved in a project where the no sleep vibe is adapted to a video game. That would be a dream come true.
Oh, for sure. I'd love to see that.
Yeah.
What's AJ's asking what's a podcast?
What is a podcast?
Yes, it's whatever you want it to be.
It's where dreams come true.
Exactly. So do you have any advice for anyone getting into the world of podcasting that you could impart with them?
I would say don't. It's too late. It's too late. No, it's interesting. Podcasting has always been available to anybody. I mean, if
Mhm.
you have you spend less than $100, you get a microphone, you get a $5 a month plan at some podcast hosting company, and you've got a podcast, and you can create it, and it's there. And if you want to do that, and that's your passion, and you've got a voice, meaning you have a perspective, you have something you want to say, whether it's like on a conversational podcast or
Mhm.
if you're telling a story, whatever it is. If that's what you want to do, then go for it. I mean, there's endless courses online and things you can learn how to do it from a technical perspective. Um, what I think when I joked at the start about saying don't do it, it's too late. Because when we started back in 2011, it really was still a um, sort of an independent. I was going to say an amateur kind of medium.
Right.
People were doing it who didn't know how to do it, but nowadays, or as time went on, Hollywood discovered it, big money discovered it,
Mhm.
celebrities discovered it, and so nowadays you're not going to get to the top of the charts unless, of course, you do something incredibly magical, because there's all these celebrities who have their own podcasts, and
Right.
um so yeah, if you want to get into podcasting for the love of it, for the passion, and like I said, because you've got a voice or a story to tell, absolutely jump into it, but recognize that you're going to have to cultivate your own smaller audience, and you're going to have to build it by word of mouth, which is kind of
Right.
how we did it way back then.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I said, yeah, like I said, I like to do this just because I love talking to people in the world. I like talking to behind the scenes people. We've had a lot of production designers and people in the horror world that really don't get to tell their voice. They were
Yeah.
like, oh, I want to talk to Heather Langenkamp. I want to talk to Robert England. No one cares about the gaffer that made the movie possible. And that's why I like doing the show. So we get to talk to people like that too.
Yeah, and those people are incredibly talented, and like you said, they've got stories to tell. And you know, I mentioned being on set for Tales from the Void.
Hmm.
The level of skill and the passion and the all the behind the scenes things that most people never see. It's a magical experience to see these people working. It was described to me as being very much like a military operation. Everybody kind of has their role. There's certain ranks,
Hmm.
who you have to report to and stuff. And to see a good film crew, especially the kind we had on Tales from the Void, work their magic and do their jobs. It's yeah, I would listen to any podcast where you're interviewing people who are doing sound, doing the rigging, doing the lighting, all that stuff. There's incredible stories there.
For sure. Absolutely. All right. So it's time for your random horror movie question. Are you ready for this?
I am ready.
All right. Bruce Campbell plays a man who believes he's Elvis Presley in this 2002 film.
Bruce Campbell. Oh, it's so funny you mentioned Bruce Campbell. If there is one beloved horror franchise that has never been on my radar. It's the Evil Dead franchise. And I saw the first one. I saw the original, of course, but all of the other stuff. And then when you get into, I only know this, from pop culture references, but I know Bruce Campbell is, I think it's Ash, and then there's all these sequels and stuff like that. So I would have to just take a shot in the dark. It's something to do with Ash. There was some movie Ash, and Ash meets this, or Ash does Dallas, or something. So that's my final answer.
It's Bubba Hotep. Yeah, it's an elderly Elvis Presley at a retirement community, and he's still alive because he switched places with Sebastian, and the person that died was one of his Elvis impersonators. And oh, I think it was, can't remember, Ozzy. He plays JFK. He's still alive.
Wow.
And they're finding a come back to life mummy who is sucking the souls of old people from their butts.
It just writes itself. It's such a natural movie. Well, I don't think I've ever heard of that, so I don't feel quite as bad to not get that answer.
I just know it because anyone that knows me, I love Bruce Campbell, everything he does. Like I said, my son's named Ash Williams just because.
Is that right? Oh, well, that's, boy, I now I feel my face is red because I just don't, I never had the time to get into the Evil Dead sequels, all those
so
movies.
Good.
Yeah.
So good. Well, before we sign off, give us your pluggables, Dave. Where can people follow you, find you, and get updates for Tales from the Void and the No Sleep Podcast?
Right. The nosleeppodcast.com is our website. You can find, we have a huge archive of episodes. There's literally hundreds of hours to consume there. So check that out. At No Sleep Podcast, pretty much on any social media platform. For myself, I trying as best I can to sort of pull back from social media these days. It's kind of rots my brain. I'm most active on Instagram. I had to get a new account there, so I'm at David Cummings Official there. And if you find your way there, I have a Linktree to whatever stuff. So if you find my Linktree, there will be the Tales from the Void website, and there was a great article written about us in Variety talking about the series. But I believe the website for the show is talesfromthevoid.tv. So check that out.
Awesome. I do have a link in the description to the Linktree in the description below, so make sure to check it out. And I've been Graveyard. You can follow us on all social media at PodOutatNight. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe to this video, because as we get more subscribers, we're going to be giving away free horror swag, signings, and cons and stuff like that too. So really appreciate you, the audience watching tonight, and I'm deeply grateful, David, for you coming on and joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. I had a blast. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so make sure to listen to the No Sleep Podcast and see if you can't fall asleep. And we'll see you next time. Good night.